All right. I once again did not look up what session number this is, but tonight is the promised session on the timing of the war in heaven and Satan's being cast out. Next week we will pick up right where we left off as far as the passages, and we will begin a look at Revelation chapter 12. Public service announcement. The timing of Satan's being cast out of heaven is a tertiary issue. All right, so not only is it not an issue whereby we must say you are heretical or apostate. No, not even close. Not even second order. This is a third order issue. So you do not have to agree with me in this at all. It doesn't touch that many other doctrines that I know of. That's one of the things, when you talk about how important certain doctrines are, the question always arises, or should arise, what else does it touch, right? So doctrines depend upon each other and are built upon each other. So far as I know, agreeing on the timing of the war in heaven just doesn't affect much. So, it has come up a few times in our current series, as well as another lesson on a previous Wednesday night. And so I think probably across the board, I'm the first person you've ever heard to present this view, and that's okay. And if your reaction has been to this point, that makes no sense, and I've never heard it like that, that's okay. The timing of doing this is because Revelation chapter 12 is the first text that caused me to think about this issue and try to search it out. It was one of those things, the text said something that didn't fit in my mind with my understanding, so it sent me on a journey, and I have landed where I have landed. But again, this is not a dogmatic issue, but we're going to talk about it. I said we would talk about it, and this is preface for what we will talk about next week on chapter 12. Okay. There are some challenges right off the bat. This subject is rarely addressed directly. Part of the reason for that is because everybody assumes that we know, and it's kind of not questioned, right? That's the way it was with me. I'd never heard anybody have any other view than that the war in heaven had taken place way in the beginning and that Satan had been cast out prior to the Garden of Eden, prior to Genesis chapter 3. I think most of us grow up hearing that, not necessarily taught, but just sort of assumed, and so we pick up those assumptions and we run with them until we're challenged on it. Another challenge is the Old Testament's really sparse about details. Probably more so than you currently think. We'll look at that tonight. Truth be told, there's not a whole lot in the New Testament, right? For to be such a main character, Satan is not described in detail that often. There aren't that many actions that we have directly attributed to him. So we'll look at that. Another challenge is that Satan is treated too often as a lesser god than a created being. Here's what I mean by that. Outside of Christianity, there are many other philosophies. Several of them presuppose this sort of balance, that there always must be an equal amount of dark as to light, right? This sort of yin-yang, right? That kind of thinking has seeped into Christian churches, and sometimes we don't even know it. And so what winds up happening is we wind up talking about Satan as if he is the eternal enemy of God with which God must wrestle, and finally we do believe he will be overcome. That's giving far too much credit to Satan. Truth be told, going off of the sermon this morning, we believe in one God creator, right? So if God is the creator of all things outside of God, and if we hold to what the Bible teaches, that he holds in subsistence all of creation, right? The reason that planets don't go out of their orbit, the reason there is gravitational forces in the universe, the reason that chemicals work the way they do is because God wills them to continue doing so. So if that's the case, and if Satan is part of that creation, which he is, then there's no struggle. If God willed that Satan be ended, all he would have to do is stop willing him to continue in existence. That's a more accurate picture. And so sometimes we, again, because we have these other influences that have sort of seeped in, and because we're never challenged on it, we kind of get this idea that Satan, he's just almost as powerful as God. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say that, but I've heard a lot of people say things that sound like that. So we need to be careful with that. He's a created being that fell, right? Not a lesser God. Lastly, it is always challenging to assign a time and date to an eternal event. And we're not going to go into the various theories and my understandings of time and eternity and how that interplays, because A, we don't have time for that. B, some of you just your eyes glaze over when I do it. And C, I don't really have a firm grasp on it, let's be honest. But this I do know. We live in a temporal realm. God is dealing with us in this temporal realm, but he exceeds that. He's a transcendent God. He is in no way limited by time and space. And so the things of heaven, nailing them down to this day at this time, and let's get, by the way, the atomic clock reading on that to know exactly when this happened. When you're talking about eternal things, it's kind of, well, for the Whovians and sci-fi fans, it's wibbly wobbly. It's squishy. It's kind of funny. All right, let's move on. So tonight's approach, I want to lay out all the pieces before we try to put them together. We'll be looking at Old Testament texts. We'll be looking at some extra biblical sources that you were influenced by and you didn't even know it and may have never heard the titles of. And we'll look at some New Testament texts as well. Fair enough? Old Testament. All right. By the way, if you don't have your Bibles open already, there are scriptures on the screen. Somebody should be. I see Nani's turning to Numbers 22, I think. 1 Samuel. Oh, that's amazing. She was right there. That was providential. All right, 1 Samuel 29. We're going to need Psalm 109. 1 Chronicles 21, 2 Samuel 24. All right, for the first three, they are they're not the only three by any means, but there are three instances where we find the word in the Hebrew text, Satan. I'm going to ask you to read those and guess where it is, because it's not Satan in your English translation. What we need to understand from this is that most often when the word Satan, which is actually pronounced pretty close to that, even in the Hebrew, it's not a name. It's not even a formal title most of the time. So, let's talk about Numbers 22 and 22.
And God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the way for an adversary against him. Now he was riding upon his ass, and his two servants were with him. She's
reading the King James, y'all. All right. Where in that verse is Satan? And I don't mean the character, I mean the word.
The adversary?
Adversary. Yeah. It's rightly translated there as an adversary. That's what the word means. But if we were reading in Hebrew, we would have said at that point, Satan. I think, in fact, it's Ha-Satan or something like that. All right, 1 Samuel 29 and 4.
And the princes of the Philistines were wroth with him, and the princes of the Philistines said unto him, Make this fellow return, that he may go again to his place which thou hast appointed him. And let him not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he be an adversary to us. For wherewith should he reconcile himself unto his master? Should it not be with the heads of these men?
All right, so Matt gets to cheat because Nani's already gone, but where in that verse is Satan? Adversary. And who's that describing? The man. Right? Not speaking of a supernatural enemy of God, not speaking about some lesser god, fallen angel, any of that, just an adversary. That's what it means. All right, Psalm 109, verse 6. You do not get to cheat as much, but I think you'll get it right anyways. Who's got that?
Set thou a wicked man over him, and let Satan stand at his right hand. Let's say Satan.
Ah, all right. Well, if it's in the English there, sometimes it's translated. Which one are you reading?
Mine's always King James.
Okay. If you're reading in the ESV, it would be as an accuser. Okay? Or NIV or several of the others. I don't remember them all off the top of my head. All right. So point being, usually in the text, it does not refer to one evil mastermind. In fact, in Psalm 109:6, the King James translators would have been better there to say accuser, right? That's what it means. Now, is it then a fitting title or a fitting name? We know that in the Old Testament especially, names for people often carry great meaning. Is it a fitting name for the character that we know as the devil to be called Satan, an accuser and an adversary? Absolutely. Makes great sense. But what we shouldn't automatically assume is, oh yeah, adversary. See, it's reinforcing the fact that he's the enemy of God from the very beginning. Because this is also the term for an accuser, for prosecuting attorney, so to speak. Right? Or really for any resistance. It's got a broad use in that way. Someone who's going to be against me. So, someone who stood against the Philistines, who were the unrighteous enemies of God's people, would have been a Satan to the Philistines, you see. So, that's just the way the language was used. Let's move on to our next clue, or next help. The curious case of 1 Chronicles 21 and the parallel account, 2 Samuel 24. All right? Who's got 1 Chronicles 21?
I'm King James Version, so it's in that.
So yeah, mine says.
No, yeah, that's right.
That's okay. And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel.
Who stood up?
Satan.
Okay, 2 Samuel 24. Parallel account, recording the same events.
Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go, number Israel and Judah.
All right, so remind me again. Nani, who incited David to number Israel in 1 Chronicles 21?
Satan.
Satan. And I'm going to say that's a right understanding as a character, as a person, not just as a description. But Matt, 2 Samuel 24. Who incited David? The Lord. Anybody see a problem there? I see some scrunched up noses, which indicates yes. All right, just to make sure we didn't read it wrong, go ahead and flip back and forth between the two. You see, if you don't find that...
The way that it's brought to you, though, right? It's like Satan had this happen, but it's still God makes things happen. So, it can be the same.
The tension there is, it is rightly attributed to Satan, it is rightly attributed to God.
Yes, we're clearing that up. Because God allowed it to happen, but Satan
Well-
was the instrument in this situation?
He was absolutely, I think absolutely the instrument. I'm going to present a bit stronger case than God allowed it to happen. But that's just one little nugget, one little clue. When I began looking into this, that was one of those that stuck out and said, now wait a minute. Right? Now this is not necessarily unlike, to your point, when we talk about the crucifixion of Christ. And I don't know how many of you recall the many controversies when Mel Gibson put his movie out years ago, and the cry was going to be, well, which is his movie going to say? That it was the Romans that crucified him or that it was the Jews, right? Great argument, because the answer is yes. Right? The Jews said, crucify him. The Romans crucified him. In the movie, by the way, it was his hands, because he wanted to avoid as much of that as possible, right? But the Scriptures, who do the Scriptures attribute to putting an end to Christ? God. More than one occasion, right? It was the foreordinate plan of God. Or if you go Old Testament, right? Prophet Isaiah, it pleased the Father to bruise the Son. It was the holiness and the justice of God the Father that demanded the punishment of the Son in order to save sinners, right? So we could at least say God has ordained this thing, and then there are other instruments. What was that the word you used? Okay, that's at least true here. But it's a clue, I think, to the overall picture. Who incited David? Satan. Yes. The Lord? Yes. By the way, it's not a translational issue. That's the way it is. Okay? You don't find like another translation that got that fixed. That's the way it should read between those. All right. Let's look at some more texts in the Old Testament. Here are three that are generally accepted, in fact, usually just flat out taught to be about this character, Satan, the devil, but he's actually not named. I'm not saying that they're not. These are just clues that we're laying out to piece the whole thing together. So, Genesis chapter 3. Now, the serpent was more subtle in the King James, or crafty in some of the more modern English translations, than any other creature, right? Who was the serpent? Historically, and I'm not going to tell you any differently tonight, so don't think I'm trying to change everything. Historically, the position has been that that's either Satan himself in some sort of appearance, or else him embodying or sort of possessing the body of some strange serpent. Either way, it's him. Right? And here's where it becomes so obvious with all of our presuppositions. We go, it's clear-cut case. Look right here. The devil's working against God from the beginning. Right? Let's read the text. Try to not read it. Try to come to the text blankly. How's that? Look at what he says. And I want you to show me where he lied. He doesn't lie. Now, is it clear that he's after something here? Yeah. I'm not going to deny that either. But he doesn't make a statement directly against God. In fact, he tells the truth. Right? You won't surely die. Well, they didn't instantly. In fact, God knows as soon as you eat this fruit, you'll be as gods, understanding. The Bible says their eyes were open. So he doesn't lie. And he isn't named. I'm not saying it's not him. I'm just saying it's not as clean-cut and a consistent picture as we often think it is. Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 14. It'll become clear why I bring that up. I'm not trying to just question everything and pull the rug out from under you by any means. Isaiah chapter 14. This is one of the places that we are told we're given a bit of understanding and background information as to the devil and his fall. Right? But to whom is this addressed? Read verse 14. Or excuse me, verse 4. Chapter 14. Forgive me. You will take up this taunt against whom? King of Babylon. Now, all my life, I have always heard this taught as this is a prophecy about the devil falling, especially when you get into verse 12, right? How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn, how you were cut down to the ground, who laid the nations low. I want to say tonight, it's first and foremost about the literal king of Babylon.
They're just calling him a name.
So that's very much like the times where in the Hebrew text it says Satan and it's translated adversary, right? It's a translation there. But yeah, but there's a meaning behind that. Take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. And it was about him. It was about the wicked king of Babylon, who was, by the way, cut down from his prideful place. Now, this being a prophecy, this being in that realm of symbolism, in that realm of foretelling, I'll not say it's not about, but it's not primarily about. It's primarily about the king of Babylon, just like it says. Similarly, in Ezekiel chapter 28. Tonight is the quiet night. Ezekiel 28. This will begin in verse 11. To whom is this lament addressed? So Ezekiel 28, verse 11.
The rest of the Son of Man.
Raise a lamentation over whom? The king of Tyre. Now, because he goes on and he says about the king of Tyre, you are the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. So again, I've always heard this just flattened out into a literalistic, well, it says the king of Tyre, but really this is about the devil. And I'm here to say once again, it was about a real king. It is the language that was commonly used of the day to talk about the perfections of someone in an exaggerated manner, and then God's judgment upon them. And there is no other text that directly ties the two, or ties the king of Babylon, the king of Tyre. There's no other text that says when that was mentioned, this really meant. It's not there. Again, I'm not saying there's no connection, but we have had a tendency to say, well, this is all it's about, and it's just that simple, and it's done. And I don't think it's quite that simple at all. Right?
So we say, and just to bring it down to today, if you keep turning the TV without hearing the word ISIS.
Right.
Now, there are named players at different levels worldwide, but they all represent the same antithetical thought. So is that what you're saying about this? All of this, anything that's adversary to God would be named under the same, basically in intergeneration.
Some of the language, the way it was used, it would come across to us that way. I am saying these two prophetic passages are about individuals. But
I'm
yeah.
saying you can turn on and there's
Yeah.
somebody in Iran that's actual, but he's not the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
When he's gone, somebody else will take up but the whole thing is a concept of anti-Christian.
Yes. That's at least a part, right? All right, so let's look at a couple texts that I think are more clear. Let's, for instance, open to the book of Job. This is a troubling passage, if you've never looked at it in earnest, quite honestly. This is one of those times where I think the first time when I took the time to read what it said, it was exactly the reverse of what I thought it said. All right? So there's this man Job. Now, not perfect in the sense that he was not a sinner. None are except Christ. But he was an upright man. He was a righteous man. He followed God. He repented of his sins. He made sacrifices and performed that priestly role for his family. All right? And then it says that there came a day when the sons of God, and the picture here is of a heavenly council. So we're talking about heavenly beings. We're talking about angels, right? And so God is presiding over a heavenly court, as it were. Not that they were autonomous from God, but that's how God reveals himself. He's listening to them, and they are there. Much like when the Bible says that we will reign, that doesn't mean that we then in some weird Mormon type deal, become gods of our own. No, no, no. We reign with Christ. So here's God, fully in authority, but he has his heavenly court. And somebody else is mentioned as being there. Satan. Now, who is it that first mentions Job?
God.
Absolutely.
He's proud of him. It sounds like at the beginning you get the sense that he's proud of him because he's out of everybody on earth.
He's a righteous man, yeah. Have you considered my servant Job? If you've never thought about that before, listen now. The whole rest of the book would have never come about had God not said, hey, look at Job. So what role is Satan playing in chapters 1 and 2 of Job? He's testing Job. He's trying his best to prove that Job's faith is not perfect, authentic, real, right? Oh, he's only worshiping you, God, because you've lavished him with riches and with lands. And you take that stuff away, he'll curse you. Okay? Right? Just layer by layer. Oh, it's only because. His role in this, now because of our presupposition and because, quite honestly, none of us wants to endure what Job endured, we automatically equate Satan's role in this as wicked, evil, opposing God. But who sicked the devil on Job? And that's intentionally strong language, but God did. He is viewed here, he is displayed here as God's prosecuting attorney, the tester, the one that is going to go and make sure, the one that's going to shine the light in the face, right? All those old school 80s police dramas. They get the suspect in the room. They got the two-way mirror, and they got the light shining in their face, and they're slamming their fist. Tell me about it, right? That's Satan here. He's trying to get out of Job that he doesn't really love or believe in God. And he doesn't get it. Look at Zechariah chapter 3. Here we find a very interesting scene, but not so unfamiliar, having just discussed and thought about Job. Here we find the high priest in, again, what could be described as sort of a courtroom scene. We have the angel of the Lord standing there, and we have who? Satan. What is his role? Again, he is the prosecuting attorney. Right? My contention is that Job and Zechariah show us most clearly of all the Old Testament texts what was God's intended purpose for Satan. Right?
To test his people.
Yes. So when later he's called the accuser of the brethren, he was supposed to be the accuser of the brethren in the beginning. Now, I'm going to say that doesn't mean, I'm not saying that he didn't have malicious intent. I'm not going to say he didn't act out of pride. I'm not going to say that he didn't overstep. But God had an intention and a purpose for him all along to be that. To be the one to accuse. To be the one who would say, look at these people. This is not real faith. You're just too good to them. Look at all the things that they have done. Look at the ways they have failed you. Right? There's a great old hymn. It says, when Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the guilt within. Humbly, I'm losing the words at the moment. Upward I look and see him there who made an end to all my sin. There we go. Point being, it was the devil's job in the first place to point out the flaws. We see him doing that. That sort of makes sense of Genesis chapter 3. Did God really tell you you can't eat the fruit? Right? He doesn't come out and lie. Even when he's tempting Christ, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, right? He's quoting from Scripture. The devil, Satan, from the beginning, was the ultimate legalist. He knew all the rules better than any human ever did. And he was ready, Johnny on the spot. You've broken law such and such, paragraph 3, subparagraph 2, because you did this, right? He knew it and he was ready to accuse. We see him as this prosecuting role, this testing role from the beginning. We don't see a lot of detail, but we definitely see him here. Now, here's the interesting thing, that until you're challenged to think about it, you don't realize. The Old Testament contains no denouncement or overt depiction of Satan as the enemy of God. It's not there. We don't find Moses speaking of him this way. The closest you might get to that really is how strongly you take the Isaiah those prophecies. How much of it was it not only about the kingdom of Babylon or Tyre, and how much of it was sort of prophetic. But there's no clear denouncement. There's no text like we find in the New Testament. We will find it. So I'm not saying you're wrong for ever thinking the devil was the enemy. I'm just saying it's not clearly taught in the Old Testament. And it is right to take the New Testament clarification and teaching and apply it backwards, but there is a sense that we can over-apply that. Remember that I said one of the challenges is oftentimes Satan is treated as a lesser god, as if he was an eternal being, when really he's a part of creation and he has an arc, if you will, right? In the literature they talk about arc, character development. Things happened, right? If we were to talk about humankind, for instance, if you read the New Testament, how much good, innate goodness is there about humanity? None. We're despicable. We are completely dependent upon the grace of God. But there was a time when that wasn't true. The first family, the first couple, created in a holy state. And I'm saying a very similar thing is true of Satan. He's not eternally evil. God didn't create an evil being. Satan fell similarly to Adam, to humans.
Except for there's no redemption for him.
That is a big difference, yes. Adam was the federal head of humanity for which Christ became, according to Paul, the second Adam, therefore providing means of salvation. There's no federal headship in angels. They're not a race in the way that we are. We have no idea, well, some people have a lot of ideas, but no textually based idea about how many angels there are, right? They were just created. In fact, we don't precisely know the moment, and there we go again, trying to pin down a moment about eternal things. When in creation were they created? We just must say they were created in the beginning with everything else. All right, so no clear denouncement in the Old Testament, but we do find Job and Zechariah showing Satan in the role of a prosecutor or an accuser. All right, so what about extra-biblical influence? These books are not part of the canon. They are not Bible. They're not breathed out by God. However, they're interesting. Some of them are helpful. And at least they can show us how some thoughts developed. For instance, the book of 1 Enoch is fundamental in the development of Satan as a malevolent celestial being with a contingent of evil spirits under his command. So says the Lexham Bible Dictionary. You don't have to quote that exactly. Write whatever's helpful to you. There's a book called The Life of Adam and Eve, which was probably the first to connect the serpent of Genesis 3 to Satan in writing. I'm not saying it was the first time someone thought it. I'm saying there's no record of it being written before that. The book of Jubilees portrays Satan as a ruler of an evil kingdom and the power behind the Egyptian sorcerers, which I believe, by the way, One of the times when this topic came up in the past, I can't remember who, someone asked about, what about the witches in the Old Testament? What about the demons in the Old Testament? We'll put all that together.
Interestingly enough, I don't know if Randy remembers this, but in our Christian school, they taught the fact that the Egyptians were able to do these things as magic tricks or sleights of hand instead of giving Satan the power to do the magic.
I don't know that you can nail down for sure one way or the other, but I'm certainly open to the fact that they were empowered to do things. There certainly was a lot of other weird things going on that some of it could have been trickery, some of it demonic. All right, the Qumran literature. You've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Pretty important find when talking about the archaeology or the history of the texts and understanding Jewish and Christian thought. But the Qumran community, some of their literature, they called Satan Belial most often and compared him to Michael, the archangel, which is much better than lesser God. And lastly, the Wisdom of Solomon, which, by the way, don't think that was written by the Solomon of the Bible, but it speaks of Satan's envy as the cause for his fall, which kind of connects those prophetic passages from our Old Testament. All right, now, why do I bring this up? Because all these match what we kind of grew up thinking, assuming, believing, right? So take a stab when these things were written. Primarily, Second Temple Judaism, which means not long before the birth of Christ or a little bit after. Maybe for a century, some of it, right? So if this is the first time some of these things were written, man, I have to pick up the pace. My point in bringing these things up is that it was a development of thought that wasn't clearly taught necessarily early on. All right, I'm picking up the pace officially. Are you done with this slide, or can we go? We can always come back. All right, so let's talk about the Gospels. Now, I did not include in this presentation because I knew I would have too much anyways. I didn't include everything that was said about the devil in the New Testament. He's commonly referred to as being the tempter, as being dangerous. We take up the armor of God, the shield of faith to quench the fiery darts, all that stuff. But I'm just talking about actions. There's not much. We have Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, right? Matthew 4, Mark 1, Luke 4. Jesus tells Simon Peter that Satan desires to sift you as wheat, Luke chapter 22. At the institution of the Lord's Supper, we find the passage in Luke 22 and John 13 both record that Satan enters Judas, some kind of possession, we might say. And we find Jesus in Luke chapter 10 saying that he saw Satan fall like lightning. As far as actions in the Gospels, that's it. So, we have to look at a couple texts quickly, more in depth. Well, we started a few minutes late, so you give me a couple minutes, right? Maybe if it's interesting. I'll try to make it interesting. All right, Luke chapter 10. This is the interesting part. I know that the flipping back and forth Old Testament passages can get a bit dry. Luke chapter 10. All right, we're in the Gospels. We got Jesus. He has sent out the 70 disciples. They've done amazing things. They come back, and they're amazed. Verse 17, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And that's where Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. This is a clue. Again, it's hard to nail down the timing of things of eternal content, but here's a clue. So, what is the context? What is this discussion about? From Luke 17 to Luke 10 and 17 through verse 20. These 72 have come back. They're rejoicing. They're telling Jesus the amazing things that they've seen, and Jesus is talking to them about the truth and the realities about what's going on during this time. Right? We shouldn't get the picture. Like, you've seen some like fantasy movies, like the guy who is the great poobah of wisdom, in whatever universe that you want to choose. And sometimes people would come up and talk to them, and they would just speak about something completely different. Like, how are you doing today? And then the old guy with the long beard would say, 30 years ago, right? No, Jesus didn't really do that. He mostly answered questions, even though he challenged them, but he dealt with people. So if you walk up to him and say, this, Jesus, he's going to respond to you. So when they say, Jesus, it's amazing, even the demons are subject to us, and Jesus turns around and says, I saw Satan fall like lightning. He's talking about what they were talking about. Does that make sense? So they're saying, this is amazing. Like, people are getting healed, people are getting saved, we're casting out demons, it's crazy. And Jesus says, it's crazier than you know, because the kingdom of heaven is advancing and Satan is being defeated. That's what Jesus was saying. Right? Yeah. When? When did Jesus see it? Yeah, right at the same time they were talking about. So Jesus' response, Jesus' comment about Satan falling like lightning had to do with those disciples going forth, preaching, teaching, healing, casting out devils. Right? Otherwise, you just got Jesus talking out of his head in the middle of some... Right? This is an interaction here. And so, what's the message? They're saying, look, this is actually working. And my paraphrase of Jesus is, it's working even more than you know. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's move on, because I am in fast-paced mode. All right. Now, Revelation chapter 12, the text that began this great search for me all along. Which we will handle in more depth and completely next week. But let's take a look. All right, so we're in the Revelation. We're talking symbols. We're talking about a vision, kind of like a dream, right? Fluid symbolism. Great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and with a head, on her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains, the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. And his tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Let's pause there. Verse 5. I know this is not an in-depth treatment of this text, but the child who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Just, who is that?
Jesus.
Yeah, that's plain. Not only is it also referenced earlier in the Revelation, but that just matches with all the prophecy about Christ. So, we're talking about the birth of Christ, right? And again, we'll get into more depth next week on this text. But we skip down to verse 7. Now war rose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated there, and there was no longer place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent. Here you go. Nice and easy place. This should be comforting to you. I'm saying here the text confirms that way back in Genesis 3, we're still talking about the devil. Right? He is that old serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth. Question. When did that casting happen? Was it before or after the birth of the child? In this vision.
Looks like after.
Yeah. Was it before or after the child was caught up to heaven?
Seems like after.
Seems like after. All right, so if we're talking about Christ, teaser for next week, we are. The timing of this seems like after crucifixion, resurrection. Continue reading on in the 12th chapter. Let's see. Verse 10, and I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before God. So before this time, day and night before God. Where was his access? In heaven. This matches everything in the Old Testament. This matches Job chapter 1 and 2. This matches Zechariah 3, right? If he's not been cast out yet, it makes sense that he's still able to be in heaven. By the way, that's one of the great problems. If you say that he was cast out before time, you have him going back to heaven, which God certainly could allow. God's God. But it's not mentioned that way in the text, right? All right. Verse 11. Somebody read for me Revelation chapter 12, verse 11.
And then, go ahead.
And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death.
How was he conquered?
The blood of the Lamb.
Blood of the Lamb and the witness of people. Yeah. Verse 12. Go ahead and read that.
Verse 12, is it?
Verse 12.
Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe unto the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea. For the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time.
All right. We will not have a lengthy discussion of this, but just knowing what we know of Scripture, and specifically what we've been talking about in this series on the Revelation, talk about what marks the end times. Why is his time cut short? The answer that most easily fits with the flow of the text is because it's the end times. The last days that were marked by the coming crucifixion and resurrection of Christ Jesus. Now, all of this is referenced in connection, direct connection with the casting down. All right? One more place we need to look, and we will put the pieces together. You've been very patient with me tonight. John chapter 8. All right, one of the many interactions between Jesus and the Jews of his days, of his day. The first question is, to whom was Jesus speaking? That answer you can find in verse 13. So the Pharisees said to him. So who was he interacting with? No doubt there were other people there. He was specifically reacting or interacting with a group of Pharisees. Now, we go down just a little bit further. This is, by the way, if you didn't look at the top of the page or previous pages, is immediately after the account given of the woman caught in adultery. So Jesus goes on to say that you are like your father, the devil. Verse 39, they answered him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. Now clearly, in the flesh, by blood lineage, they were Abraham's children. Jesus was speaking a bit deeper, of course. But now you seek to kill me, a man who told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are doing the works that your father did. Why were they said to be of the devil? Yeah. They tried to get the woman. They tried to trip up Jesus at every point. They were acting as picture-perfect legalists. That was what they did. That was their mindset. And so Jesus rightly says, you're just like your father. Remember what I said about him? He is the epitome of the legalists. Satan is. Right? So Jesus continues on. Verse 44, you are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires, to accuse. That's what we can constantly see them doing throughout the Gospels. To oppose Christ and to accuse the church. Then Jesus says he was a murderer from the beginning. All right, so whatever we say about it, that's got to fit too. So, here's my attempt to put this together. Job, not Job. Yes. Yes. First birth, then school, then a job. No. Job. And that's a song that needs parodying. Get a Job. All right. All right, so the timeline begins with creation. Why? Because Satan is a created being. He's not an eternal creature. He was not from everlasting. He was not in the predeterminate council. That was not him. He's a created being. Now, to ease some of your minds and to answer some of your questions, Jesus just said in John chapter 8, we just looked at it, he was a liar and a murderer from the... Now, we could take that two ways. We could take that as Jesus was naturally speaking the way that we might speak and say he means way back when. Or we can believe that God created him evil. Try that dilemma on for size, right? All right. So, I'm saying he was evil, he had malicious intent, and he was engaging in what I'll call subversive activities from way back in the beginning. So while I would say that the war and the casting out was not until much later, way back here, his motives were already twisted. So when we find him in Genesis chapter 3, I firmly believe he was sent there on job as the one who was to test their faith. But because he already harbored evil in his heart, he went a step further than he should have gone. Does that make sense? All right? How many of you have ever sent your kids with a message and technically they said the same words as you, but not the same message, right? So he was sent on job to test their faith. Has God really said you can't eat? Do you really believe you're going to die? All right, but he carried it further. So way back here, I am saying he was already evil. He was subversive. He was rebelling. He was carousing with other angels who would join him in the fall. We know the scriptures speak about other fallen angels. But what's not true here is that God had not yet kicked him out of heaven. So we find the fall. We find him here in Job being the prosecuting attorney the way he was supposed to. Perhaps taking too much delight in it, but still doing what God was bidding him. We find him here at Joshua's trial, being who he was supposed to be. Now, I didn't include it as part of this presentation. I personally have the opinion that there are some other things, like, for instance, the angel of death and the 10th plague in Egypt. I think that was Satan. I cannot prove that dogmatically. You don't have to agree with me. But, in other words, I think he was doing other things for God because he was still doing God's bidding. He was just also doing other. We find him here at Jesus' temptation, much like Genesis 3, much like Job, much like Joshua. He's being the legalist. He's quoting for wrong purposes Jesus, quoting the word of God to Jesus, Jesus correcting him. Now, why is it that he hates Jesus so?
Envy?
Yes, it seems to be. Right? Think about... She did say envy, yes. So think about, for instance, the parable of the prodigal son. You're familiar. Wealthy man. Son rises up. Says, give me what I got coming. I want to go and enjoy it while I'm young. He does that. He squanders it. At the end of the story, he comes back and the father throws a huge feast and puts his robe on him and puts his rings on him, puts shoes on him and welcomes him back because his son was as good as dead and now he's returned. But what does older brother say?
That's not fair.
Yeah. Look, sisters with the same answer. There you go. All right. Yeah, that's not fair. I've been here all along. That is the mindset of the legalist. That is still alive in churches today. It is so difficult to really get a handle upon or to really embrace, in all cases, God's grace. Think about Jonah in the Old Testament, right? Why did he not want to go to Nineveh? He hated the Ninevans, and he was sure if he went, God would do that thing where he forgives them. Satan has spent all this time rightly accusing, not lying, although he is a liar, and he does tell lies. But the thing about his accusing us, accusing the saints of old, is he's usually not lying. When Satan whispers in our ears, so to speak, or one of his minions, you are a failure. When we hear a lesson taught, we come across the scripture that says our primary goal, our primary duty is to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength, and we have this voice. You don't do that. Are you familiar with the voices I'm talking about? Right? Is he lying? No. That's the worst part of it all. There is, even in the places where he does lie, there's enough truth, like when he tempts Jesus. Yeah, all those things were said, but taken out of context, used wrong. That's why Jesus said, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God, right? He is a liar. But what makes him the very best / worst / most dangerous liar of all times is from the beginning, he's known the truth and he twists it for his own purposes, and he has been doing that from the beginning. So why on earth do we not find casting out until this point? Because everybody agrees with everything else in this timeline. Everybody agrees that he wars against the church now. Everybody agrees that the Revelation says he'll be cast into the lake of fire. The only troubling part about this timeline is where I put this line that says cast out. Right? So the reason I put it there is because that's the way the text seems to indicate. But to understand it, what we want to view is he was cast out way back here, so that we have an eternal enemy, simplistic, he's just always been that way, and God immediately dealt with him. Because why would God not immediately deal with the devil? And then we look at the scriptures and we find out how many times did God immediately deal with the sins of men? Or rather, did he wait time to fulfill his purposes? Right? When God told Abraham, you're going to go, your people are going to be in bondage for 400 years until their sin is fulfilled. Right?
Well, and also, like, we tend to view Satan as a threat to God, but he's not a threat to God. He's a threat to us. So when God cast him out, he unleashed him on us.
Yep.
So why would he do it before him?
Yep. Which brings me to another point, which if you've been tracking along with our study in the Revelation, this is the time, the time in which we live, the last days. This is the time of God pouring out his judgments upon the earth. This is one of them. Who was it? You remember the last segment before we took our summer break? Who was it that gave the devil the keys to open up the pit that would release the smoke, that would become the locust, that would become, right? Where'd the keys come from? Yeah. So it's very much like Martin Luther said 500 years ago. Even when he's the devil, he's still God's devil. So to your question from earlier in the evening, is it true when we find in one place that the Lord incited David, another place that Satan incited David? Was it that Satan was the instrument? I'm going to say yes. So many times he was the instrument. He was the instrument of testing in the garden for Job, for Joshua, so many other things. But he was also being submersive all this time in the last. Subversive, not submersive. Submersive is going underneath. Subversive means rebellion. Yes. All right? So his rebellion begins way back here. But the text says he's not cast out. There was a change, a fundamental change. Right? No longer did he have direct access to heaven. Right? And it began during the ministry of Jesus. Jesus, great things are happening. Even the devils are subject to us. I saw Satan fall. It's already having its effect. And then when we have the crucifixion of Christ and the resurrection, which signals the beginning of all this, right? You remember, why was the lamb who was a lion, who was a lamb, able to open the seals. Why was he worthy? Because he had conquered. How had he conquered? Through death and resurrection. So it fits this way. All right, let me sum this up. All right, so we still have challenges because you've never heard it that way before. Yeah, me neither. And it absolutely requires a more nuanced and complex view of God dealing with the devil. He can't be that eternal baddie, right? He's got to be a created being with an ark. But the benefits, it harmonizes well with all the texts. We don't have conflicting things. We understand how that in the Old Testament it could be God and it could be devil because he was doing what God said. And we understand how that it matches the time and the purposes of the Revelation visions. If these are about the time between Jesus' first and second coming, why would we discuss the casting out of heaven? Because inasmuch as we can nail down time and date, that's when it happens. And it keeps us from, as I've said, viewing Satan as a lesser god. All right. I've run over. I apologize. But I told you I would make the case for it. This is as comprehensively as I could do it in one evening. I know it's still strange and new thought. But do you have comments or questions?
Well, in order for Christ to actually be second Adam, he would have had to been tempted in every way that Adam was in the flesh at the most weakened state a human can be.
Yes.
And when he resurrected, hope is not the right word used, but all of Satan's ever chance of
Yeah.
was done.
That's it.
But I mean, that second Adam was very, in order for God to be God, they had to be both in the flesh, so he couldn't. He would have cried foul being the Leviticus, if you're going to cast me out before Jesus ever gets here. The devil was like, hey, you know he's not going to fail. So,
Yes, that is a strong picture that I have not heard taught or preached very much, but that Jesus succeeded where Adam and Israel failed, and that is a key component of that, seeing that temptation in the wilderness. Other comments, questions? If not, I don't want to rush, but I appreciate your patience. I will still entertain questions about this in the future, but now you've sort of seen it soup to nuts. And so it will be assumed, if you will, going forward in my treatment of the texts. Next week, chapter 12.